The project itself was conducted in Squamish, BC. So for those of you who are not familiar, it's about 50 kilometers north of Vancouver. I have a map of it right here. A very beautiful town that is got a population of about 20,000, probably a bit over that now. The census in 2016 had it around 19,000, but it's grown quite rapidly. The geography around is quite complex. You get this this really wonderful terrain. A lot of it is Squamish is situated in the valley, but as you can see, this like gorgeous mountainscape around it. So that mountainscape is actually a fairly important aspect of people's local sense of place and why they like to be there. It's considered a recreational capital of Canada, so a lot of people go out there to do outdoor sort of recreation activities. The project that I did was a community-based participatory research project. So I'm developing these tools for integrated planning. And like I was saying, integrated planning requires participatory processes. So in my mind, it just made sense if I was developing these tools to support planning processes, then I should include the community in there and ask them what their planning concerns and needs are when we develop these tools so that it is actually relevant to the community itself. And these tools, hopefully, are actually useful rather than it just being a pure research project. The project consisted of 3 phases. You can kind of loosely break it up into 3 phases. The first one was around creating a community systems model and development scenarios. So that systems model is similar to that thing that I was showing you, that conceptual model, saying if we were to do these different strategies for development, different plans and policies, what would this mean for a whole variety of social, environmental, and economic factors? And how do those factors relate to one another? So if we work in this area, what does it mean for this whole constellation of things? We had to create that systems model to be able to create our tools for integrated planning, or integrated models, so to speak. The other thing that we created are something called development scenarios, these community development scenarios. What these things do, or what they are in a nutshell, is they define different ways that the community can develop, so different trajectories, whether this means that we want a community that continues to do low density residential development, we want a community that has neighborhoods that have like mixed use commercial nodes in there, perhaps maybe that's a sort of development pattern or a development path that we want to go on. So these community development scenarios, in a lot of ways, they can be defined by particular factors, but really what they are is a sort of a story as to how the community will develop, like a narrative of what the community will look like in the future. Now, after that, after we came up with those things, and I worked collaboratively with the community to create these and define these, the systems model and development scenarios, what I did was we took this and we applied it to an integrated model and community scenario analysis exercise. So basically what this means is that we're looking at all these possible outcomes, whether it's around local employment, habitat loss, greenhouse gases, the things that the community wanted to explore. Looking at the relationships of the model, we came up with ways of being able to measure and calculate those. And it's a fairly involved process, but we'll give you a brief overview when we get to that stage in the presentation. Phase 3 was about creating communication tools. The integrated model produces a lot of output that's very useful, but it produced something like 350 lines of data, and it's incredibly abstract and in a lot of ways, or it's overwhelming when you're trying to consume all that information. And like I say, these integrated planning processes, they need to be participatory. They need to be able to engage all community members, at least be broadly inclusive. So needed to create tools to be able to communicate these things properly to the community. So this involves creating an interactive explorer to look at the model, and also these 3D visualizations that you can walk through. And these are the things that we're going to get a chance to play with a little bit later on. So in phase 1, how did we design the systems model and community scenarios? How did this work in collaboration with the community? Well, in essence, had a couple focus groups. The first focus group was to meet with, it was a smaller meeting with the planning department at Squamish. What we did is we sat down and just discussed some rough ideas for community development scenarios. This was really just to give us a starting point for a conversation with a broader group of people. We weren't trying to come up with anything that was too defined, because we wanted to sort of other people's ideas, but also wanted to make sure that our a meeting with a broader stakeholder group didn't really go off in many different directions, or at least had like a firm starting point that we can build on. Also needed to chat with them about which neighborhoods would be affected by these community development scenarios. So if you're to rezone places and redevelop them in mixed use fashion, it was useful for us for the actual computational part to figure out what are those neighborhoods of interest, I'll call them here. So those neighborhoods of interest that might be affected by these things. What would be example neighborhoods for our modeling? Then focus group 2 came with these rough ideas, met with a broader community stakeholder focus group that included some of the folks from the planning department, but also people from NGOs, business interests, people from food interests, people from the private sector. So it was a diverse group of folks in terms of their interests and organizations they're involved in. And what we did was took these initial ideas and asked them, do these scenarios represent plausible futures for future conditions for Squamish? Do these seem realistic? What should we change about them? What other scenarios would you like to explore? Let's not constrain your imaginations. And also, what is a desirable future for Squamish? Like, what is like a story that would say, this is a Squamish that I'd like to live in? Then we asked some questions around what are the key questions that emerge when exploring a particular community scenario, and what are the major challenges and concerns that are faced by Squamish, things that you might be concerned about as we go through a different scenario or planning trajectory. What I just want to point out about these questions is I'm not actually asking the people, can you define like a list of scenarios for me and what's important to put in a systems model? That doesn't really make sense to people. So we're trying to come up with questions that will be able to tease out those elements of the systems model. So those key questions, you know, around if we're going to develop in this sort of way with these like mixed use neighborhoods, people might ask questions about, okay, well, do people have not just is not just about making local employment, but do people have access to amenities? How many people do have access to amenities and services? So those are the things that come out, and with that knowledge, you can actually analyze that that qualitative data and create a systems model from it. The outputs from this were a series of community development scenarios. They loosely followed a density trajectory. Like I say, though, they're actually more richer stories than that, but in a nutshell, you can kind of describe them as a low density residential scenario. There was these medium density scenarios. People were really interested in looking at a missing middle form, which refers to density between like high density and you know, the single family houses, so anything around like duplexes, semi-detached houses. And they really wanted like a diversity, a mix of these houses and neighborhoods. And then there's these high density neighborhood nodes that we can call them, and that refers to making neighborhoods as having their own commercial pocket and places where people can live, work, and play in the same neighborhood. And then this community systems model came out of like our analysis of the qualitative data. Now what you're seeing here is like not necessarily a defined solid format for all systems models. This is just basically what the data showed us. This was kind of the best way to represent the different elements and relationships in the model. The things that really come out of it here, and we'll talk about a little bit more in the next slide, but the major things that came out were these gray boxes, which refer to population growth and land availability. Respectively speaking, what that was the things that drove the model and all the elements, the major like concern. Land availability was something that restricted the model, so that was kind of a major concern. Then there's these blue elements here that were all around land uses that they want to explore. Then there's these brown nodes here, these brown elements that are around different strategies and things that you can do in order to develop your community in different ways. So whether that be like mixed use development, steep slope development, mixed housing types, that sort of thing. Then the final thing that we talked about were outcomes from the model. So things that we wanted to explore if we went down a particular storyline, a particular development path. So these are things like what's local walkability, what's local employment like, food and farm systems, what do we have in terms of capacity for growing local food, those sort of things. Once we had these things, once we had these two items, we can start doing the computational modeling. So this really required doing a fairly comprehensive literature review just to figure out different measurement methods, We used two major programs. One was ArcGIS, that's a mapping spatial analysis program. It's a very spatial model, and you'll see that in a moment. And then our statistical software that allowed us to do a lot of like calculations in there. But you know, the essence of the model is sort of really what I want to get at here. Like I mentioned, there's these like major concerns, these drivers and constraints. What really came up in conversation a lot was that we have a population currently of around 20,000. We have a medium growth projection that may say that says that we may be at 34,000 by 2036. That's an incredible amount of population growth that really changes the nature of your community and also really brings huge questions about where do people live, work, and play. Also, Squamish, as I was mentioning at the beginning, is in it's in the valley area. It's got this complex terrain. So you're actually kind of limited in terms of the land availability there. So you're actually dealing with these two things that don't really jive all that well together. There's this major model driver of the scenarios and of the elements or the relationships in the model, and then there's this major constraint. The land uses that they're really concerned about was residential space, where people are going to live, commercial space. We want local jobs. Squamish can be is sort of a bedroom community for Vancouver. I mean, not at least there's concerns that it could fully fledged turn into a bedroom community. Vancouver is fairly expensive to live in, and there are people that commute. There certainly is a lot of local employment, but people want it to be more of a place where people can live, work, and play on the same spot. Food security was an interest, so agricultural space, and then green space. It's an outdoor capital, so green space was referring to park access, but also natural and undeveloped lands for local habitat and wildlife. Then the modeling, I'm going to kind of get in and do this like fairly briefly, but I think it's worthwhile to tell you how it was done. It first required making a baseline scenario. So the baseline was, you know, current conditions. I used 2016 as current conditions because it was a census year and there was a lot of data from that time. So that's what we're kind of looking at as current. Basically what it did was mapped what Squamish is like now. So we distributed the population in houses, townhouses, and apartments, different building types right across the community of Squamish. Also distributed employment in like where people work and how many people work there and right across the community of Squamish. With that, we started bringing other data in there too. People work at schools, so there's also this like are neighborhoods walkable to schools. So things like that were in there. We had data around where were health services, also added layers of data where parks were, agricultural land. So really trying to say like, what does Squamish look like for all these factors? Then created a 2036 baseline scenario. Now what I mean by that is that Squamish knows that as the population is growing, it's a hot place to live. There is a lot of development that is approved there right now. And I took all the approved development and mapped it onto this future baseline scenario saying like, hey, before we start playing around with how the Squamish could develop in certain ways, let's make this realistic. We know that these places are going to develop. Let's see how many places there are to live, how much commercial space there is in Squamish after we take everything that is approved and planned for the community. Turns out there's actually like a lot of approved development, and it actually increased the capacity for living there by 10,000. And we're talking, it's a population of 20,000 right now. So I honestly think I was probably the first person to calculate and sum everything together, and it was a bit surprising, right? But yeah, I mean, it did make the model a little bit more realistic. Then this is where things kind of get a little bit fun, right? I mean, we start getting a bit Sin City about this. We start looking at those scenarios and those storylines, and we take those storylines and we start mapping new development in different ways around the community. So we can figure out, say, hey, if we're going to do this low residential trajectory, this is where we might have to create a new neighborhood and add new like low density housing. If we're doing a medium density scenario, it might look like this. So assuming the population will follow a medium growth trajectory, we're trying to target a future population of 34,000. Like I mentioned, with the planned development down there, we already have enough room for 29,000 people, which, or like almost 30,000 people, which means we have about 4,000 people that still need places to live. So that's the population we're distributing around. We also added, depending on the storylines, agricultural land, commercial land, amenities, community gardens, and parks depending on what the scenario was calling for. This just gives you a little bit of an idea of like what these scenarios look like. This is one of those neighborhoods of interest that I was telling you about that we use for experimenting with this model. In this particular case, we took a neighborhood and rezoned it for medium density. As you can see, it required a lot of redevelopment to get all those other people that are coming into the same sort of place. Had a little mixed use development there, so a little bit of a commercial spot with a local grocery. In the higher density one, that consisted of a mix of like townhouses and apartments, you can see that you didn't have to redevelop nearly as much space because, you know, higher density units, you can fit more people in a smaller spot. Also, the storyline kind of will show you in this higher density and also the medium density to a certain degree, we're trying to get redeveloped along transit lines too, because that was part of it, this idea of having a community with good access to transit. Now, those scenarios kind of gave you a density impression, but like I say, the storylines were richer than that. So this was a rural residential neighborhood that currently only has a population of about 800 people. When redeveloping in here, there was a lot more different elements we had there. In the medium density scenario, people also kind of wanted to see like, well, what happens if we enhance agricultural land? So we decided, let's make this good farmland out there. Let's make this into a bit of an agricultural district. This mixed use area, you'll see in the visualization, actually has a farmer's market in there. And then this area is all kind of reserved for farming. In the higher density area, we have like a more commercial area in here, more residential. But as you can see, part of the storyline was to have a community park and a community garden because there's going to be a lot of people living around there in high density units, not having backyards. So yeah, hopefully that gives you a good idea of how the mapping and modeling process went. After it was done, had another focus group, brought some more local government and community stakeholders together to look at the model. I created a package of all the graphs and so forth and did a presentation on it and say, hey, what do you think? Give me feedback. Tell me what's going on with this and we can refine this model. And turns out that it was a useful thing to do because there were definitely valid critiques, good critiques. I mean, it's important to recognize that even though we reached out to a lot of people in that first focus group, not everyone can make it to the table. So that model was only as comprehensive as the people that could show up there. In this particular case, we had about 50% of the participants were new, and engaging this new group, it went to show us that, yeah, we're missing some key pieces. Particularly, we're missing things around biodiversity. We had habitat in there, but there was key indicator species that people will say like, no, we kind of need more ecological values in there. Also, people wanted to see more things around climate adaptation, wildfire management, floodplain management. Squamish a lot of it is in a floodplain, so a big concern out there. Also things about their carbon sinks too. So these were elements that we added. The model was done in a way that was flexible enough that we could just add these things and rerun the scenarios. The other thing was that we refined the scenarios too, and found that got people to critique them and give us some feedback, refined them accordingly. I found that the first set of scenarios, there were just too many. Honestly, there was just too much information coming. I mean, like quite often, you know, you think that more is better. It's really not the case in all certain circumstances. This particular case, it kind of made it a bit foggy to figure out what these distinct development and storylines were. We had 5 scenarios to begin with, which was low density residential neighborhoods, downtown density concentration, so all new population, all those 4,000 people, let's all just fit them all downtown with redevelopment. Higher density neighborhood nodes, those were kind of those mixed use neighborhoods that I was talking about, creating commercial in neighborhoods. Missing middle medium density, so we talked about that one. That's kind of that mix of housing type, redeveloping neighborhoods like that. And then a scenario specifically for enhanced commercial space and agricultural lands. That one had medium density, but also really opened up and crafted a lot of space, allocated a lot of space for commercial and agriculture. People thought this was just too confusing. It was overwhelming. It was hard to get a sense of what the distinct trajectories were. So we collapsed this into low density residential neighborhoods. They wanted to keep that, but had said to me like, hey, you know, the development patterns you had weren't realistic. You development up the valley where really it would actually be more in the kind of eastern mountainous area. So let's do that. Medium density and enhanced agricultural land. So we kind of collapsed that medium density one and also created that agricultural district that I showed you. high density neighborhood nodes and increased densification downtown areas. So that was just sort of a node density both in downtown and all those other neighborhoods. So it took some of those density scenarios and merged them into one. Also, it kind of represents an enhanced commercial space one because you're adding a lot of mixed use areas. So adding more commercial space. And this, we ran around the scenarios, and because it was a flexible model, made a lot more sense to people. Even though it made a lot more sense, there was still a lot of information coming at people, right? So it was like I say, 350 lines of data, of output. It's just a lot for people to take in, which means that we had phase 3, which was about developing communication tools. The first thing that I created was something that you're gonna get a chance to play with because it's online. It's something that we refer to as the Model Explorer. This Model Explorer, in essence, is just it's a way of packaging the model into an interactive format to allow people to explore different aspects of it. It consists of 3 major sections. This About the Model section, where it really more or less sums up the stuff that I've just talked to you about. How was this model created? What's in it? How does it work? Then there's this Scenario Map section where people can go into those neighborhoods of interest and look at how they've developed with the different scenarios of this different like SimCity type experimentation things that we did. Then the final part, and this important one, is the model outcomes, where people have an interactive systems model and they can go scroll over the different elements, click on them, learn more about it, and actually see under the different scenarios what the output would be. So it allows them to be, gives them a bit more of an engaging and exploratory way of getting at the data and the outcomes of the scenario, as opposed to just giving them that graph package. The other thing was maybe one of the most interesting aspects of the project was the scenario visualization. So this is where we use video game software to create these scenarios. Like I say, the scenario modeling was highly spatial. So what this meant is that we had these maps here that were like had really fine spatial resolution. So we're actually mapping things down to the building level, which also meant that when we created these scenarios and mapped these scenarios, we had a good basis for creating visualizations. You can take these maps and just plot them. I mean, I'm gonna make this sound like relatively simple, but there is a bit more to it. But more or less, you can take these maps, you can bring them into a video game development environment. The program we use is called Unity, and then start building these 3-dimensional models on top of them. What that allows you to do then is allow people to give them a first-person experience of walking through these scenarios. With this first-person experience, they can then use key commands like you do in just any sort of video game and toggle scenarios on and off. So from a particular viewpoint, you can say, okay, this is what the current situation looks like, or low density, and then let's click on medium and high density, see what it looks like from the same viewpoint. And you can do that from a whole bunch of different angles of the in that neighborhood. So the real purpose of this is, you know, that integrated model, all that quantitative output, all those indicators are measured, great stuff, very useful, but this allows you to engage in those scenarios in a different way. Instead of just looking at these quantitative values and saying that, hey, this is great for these like metrics around like greenhouse gas emissions, you can actually judge scenarios on more of an emotional and visceral level. So people might see what will happen to the impacts of the viewshed, right? And like I say, viewshed was very important to people, locals, people's sense of place. So if that impacts the viewshed, then that might impact their sense of place, their place identity, place attachment. You know, they might have a visceral feeling, a visceral reaction towards it, against it, right? And these are the sort of things that don't really come out of just abstract quantitative data. So it's just another way of engaging with the scenarios. So we're about to get into like the second portion of this presentation here, which is I'm going to demonstrate these things. And we'll have a little discussion around them. And I'm going to send you links for you to be able to play with it first. But I think maybe at this stage, I wonder if it would be a good idea to just, I saw that there was a couple things that showed up in the chat box. So maybe there are some questions that, that people might have. Should we?
So it looked like we had a few housekeeping questions. Someone asking whether or not they could take screenshots of your presentation. Is that all right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm also very happy just to PDF this and put it up on the website if that's something that you do, if you want the entire presentation.
All right. I can't speak for RCI. I think they might be able to though.
Yeah, sure, thanks. Cool.
Yep.
Yeah, that sounds great. But yeah, definitely take screenshots. In fact, I recommend that you take a screenshot of this one right here, because as you're going to look at my demonstration and you're going to play with these tools, I want you to think about these questions in your mind. So yeah, not only is it can you, I'm actually requesting that you take a screenshot of this one.
Nice. And I think that's pretty much it for the questions right now.
Okay, great. Great. So what we're going to do then is we're going to start off with the Model Explorer. So as I mentioned, the Model Explorer is just something that is online, and it is it's made of like HTML. It's an HTML5 based tool, which just means that you can interact with it in a kind of a point and click way. When you enter it, this is the first thing you say. You click the beginning. It just gives a bit of background around it. What you're actually going to notice.
We aren't able to see the.
Oh. Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Yes.
no worries.
Let's do a screen share again. I probably just shared PowerPoint.
No worries.
Can you see it now?
Yes. Yes, we see the HTML. Yes, perfect.
Good. Yes. Yeah. Cool. This spaces, places, and possibility things. Good. Yeah. So this one right here. So this is the, once again, I'll give another run at it. This is the Model Explorer. So this is like the beginning screen. You just click it, and then what it does is it just gives a bit of information around the project. This is something that shows up in both the tools here, and Squamish was very clear about that. We wanted to make sure that this is not actually a planning exercise, which very fair to them. It does not reflect actual community plans, because it could seem a little controversial, but the fact of the matter is that after chatting with these folks, they said that it is still a useful tool as they're going forward with the planning. So the idea was that I did not want to sway them. I just wanted to give them a way of getting more information about how their community can develop. Like I say, there was these three sections here on the Model Explorer. The first section is just something about the model, and this is just basically all the things that I talked to you about, how we could define the community scenarios. As you click on these little houses, it gives you some storylines for each of the scenarios. So what it actually means, what the story is for the future. Us developing a community systems model, what this systems model is about, what it can do for us exploring these scenarios. The mapping, we talked about this, all the things that we mapped to get those current conditions of Squamish. And then the fact that, hey, there is a lot of development here, so let's go get those future conditions too. And then the scenario mapping, so how these scenarios work, how we calculate it. The fact that that they're on a medium trajectory up to 34,000 people. You've got capacity for almost 30,000 people, but it means that there's still 4,000 people that we need to distribute. So that's all stuff that we talked about. Now this is where things, you might find things get a little bit more interesting. Also allow people to explore these maps. So these are the different neighborhoods, these neighborhoods of interest that I keep talking about, that we kind of experimented with these scenarios. I'm gonna just maybe click on this Garibaldi Estates right here. What you can do in these maps is say then, okay, under these scenarios, what does it mean for high density? So it shows like the areas that would get developed around high density, how we mapped it, what it might look like from that overhead view. And then there's this medium density. This is, as you can see, you'd redevelop a lot more medium density residential. It's right next to a commercial area, so it didn't add any more commercial to that. And then in low density, you actually don't redevelop here. In terms of like higher density, that doesn't happen in these neighborhoods. What actually happens in low density is you develop outside and you create a new neighborhood. So then people get a chance to see like, okay, well, this is what it actually means. If we're gonna get low density, not redevelop in our neighborhoods, we have to create this massive new neighborhood outside of outside of the growth management boundaries. So in these sort of neighborhoods. And when they click the medium and high density, you don't actually see that development there. And then you can just do that for the other neighborhoods too. As you're looking through this, you can kind of explore these development patterns. This is the downtown area for these scenarios. Also, we had a focus group with, once again, community stakeholders and local governments to assess these tools. they suggested some things and they wanted to see a summary table. So we added a summary table of all the local population that would be in the areas that would be developed. Then the really, maybe like one of the most important aspects of the model is this scenario, the systems model and the output. So we talked about this systems model. I kind of gave you an idea of how it worked. Here, what you can do is you can actually interact with it a little bit more in the way that if you scroll over these elements, it highlights them and shows how that how these different the different relationships work, like basically how that commercial space relates to local employment, local businesses, local employment. So it actually gives you a little information on each of these relationships. Then when you actually click one of these guys here, these elements, and they're all clickable, what it does is it gives you some description of what this element is, what it's about, how it works, and then it gives you the outcomes. So in this particular case, what you're actually looking at here is a local business viability. So it actually is just a measure of how many employees work in places that have like enough density around them that will actually like support like walkable businesses, people walking to their local business. If you scroll over these things, you can actually see some data tables. So it just gives another little bit more information in there. Now, I do want to point out that there is a very an element that we added after the focus group that I thought was quite important. These are Squamish indicators. For a lot of these things, a lot of these different elements, we link to Squamish's community indicator system, just to show that the things we're exploring here are directly relevant to their goals, their plans, their own indicators, the things that they are tracking, and how are they relevant. So it shows that as well too. So that was an element that we added in there in response to their thoughts and needs, just to try and really make it so that this is a tool that is relevant to how Squamish wants to grow, the things that they're interested in looking at. So that is the Model Explorer, and I am going to share the link right now, just in the chat box. Sorry, it disappeared on me. I think it's yeah, sorry, I just kind of lost there it is. Yes, it's in the elusive more thing. Yeah, okay, cool. So what I'm gonna do is I'm actually just going to give you this guy, and just if you allow me to stumble a little bit more. This is the clean URL for it. And then in a moment, after I show you the visualization, you'll click that link and you'll open it up, and we'll be able to, you'll do some exploring and thinking about it yourself. Now, the next thing that I'm going to show you here is the visualization tool. So opening it up right now, I don't keep it open because it has some fun but distracting sounds that chirps in the background. So just forgive me while this loads up. You can see this fine? Yeah, Celia, maybe a nod or something? Yeah,
yes,
awesome.
That's good.
Thank you.
No problem.
So the visualization tool, as I mentioned, is developed using video game software, and it just gives you a different way of engaging in these scenarios and the material here. As similar to the Model Explorer, when it opens up, it just gives a little background on the research project and that disclaimer that seems to be so very important, which it really is, that this is not actually a planning exercise. It allows people to kind of give instructions. You can look at instructions on how to use that, but we'll probably just jump into the visualization here. We had enough time to create visualizations for two blocks in two different neighborhoods of interest. So we chose a residential neighborhood and that rural residential neighborhood that I was telling you about that currently has about 800 people. This was great. I thought we'll have time for one of them, but this was good because it did allow for a little bit of comparison. So right now I am in a place called Garibaldi Estates. This is the neighborhood. as it currently looks. And you'll notice that there are some animated elements. There's some birds chirping. You'll see a bus and bike come by fairly soon here. You can walk through the neighborhood. You're walking on specific tracks because we don't want people to get too far off the beaten path, so you can actually highlight that path there. Yeah, and you can see the bus comes by. Now, like I say, the purpose of this thing was to be able to toggle the different scenarios and be able to engage with them in that first-person perspective. So right here, I just toggled on the low density scenario. What you'll notice is there actually is a difference. So the maps don't really capture this, but we wanted to express that low density is not a no change scenario. These houses will change. So what we did is show that some of these houses probably will get redeveloped with more modern styles. It's not a no change scenario, just still low density. Then we start zoning the area for sort of medium density mixed use. This is kind of what you start seeing. This is what is looked at. This is what it looks like, and this is how it maps. And then the high density scenario, start to, it's very loud birds. I wonder if you can hear those. Yeah, the high density scenario, you start getting a little bit more, well, I mean, actually a fair bit more in the way of density. So this is an apartment building. There is some mixed use that you see in here. So like this is some commercial down at the bottom. In a bunch of these spaces, we felt that it would be pretty realistic that you'd actually have like some outdoor spaces for people to hang out. So this was like having things like this. I'm sorry if it's going very fast, but I'm just going to focus on here in a moment. So you see things like this. There are people that will gather and you see them talking. This is not just us being cute. In previous research that I've done around visualization, these elements, people's attachment to place, it is kind of relevant to like, you know, social interaction. So some people kind of look at that and might think it's crowding. Other people might look at it and say like, yes, we actually want places for social interaction. So this is kind of why we had those elements in there. Then there are other elements of this, this visualization that you can do. So you can actually look at this in terms of a map view. It just gives you a way of orienting yourself in the different, the orienting yourself in the virtual environment. So that was current. This is kind of that low density redevelopment. This is what medium density looks like here. And you can see in the center, we got this, this path, this pedestrian path. And then we have our high density. And that's how it looks like there. So I'm going to use these numbers right here refer to teleport points. I'm going to use these numbers to teleport over here because it, even though this is not a huge space, it is painfully slow to sometimes walk around in these virtual environments. And teleport points are like, if you ever decide that this is a career or thing that you want to get into, those are essential. Definitely do that. And as you can see, like based on the storyline, it did make sense to put in some new infrastructure. We have this pedestrian path. As you walk by it, dogs bark at you. Once again, not being cute. And this is just part of like our experiences when we do field work around here. And we like walked around the neighborhood. This was stuff that actually happened. So we were trying to recreate that experience as much as possible. And then, so like I said, that we have like two neighborhoods. So I'm going to pop us into this Loggers East neighborhood. This is the second one. As you can see, there's a new subdivision that's coming up onto the right, but for the most part, it is quite rural residential. There's not much developed there. This is it if you still allow for low density residential. That thing that you see to the right there, that house that just popped up, that will be developed. That area is actually slated for residential development and be sold. So it was a realistic item to put in there, or made sense for how the community would develop. Then the other option is to have things like this. You can have yourself a medium density. So some of these like multiplex units. Like I said too, this was, we're gonna have some commercial here. This was an agricultural district. So not bustling right now, but this is where the community's farmers market would be. And then the high density one that added a bit more commercial on there. And you can kind of see that like, sure, this is cool. You got commercial there. It does affect the view shed a bit for sure. And that was something that was important for us. So yeah, you can definitely start to see things here. Now you're getting your view a bit more in the way of blocked. You're not getting the same sort of mountain views as you see before. Now, a couple other features that I think are important to mention here is that after bringing this to the focus group, there was definitely a consensus that these tools are both useful, but in different ways. And there's this need and desire for tool integration. So trying to make it so that you have more of a one-stop shop. Started making some moves towards that. And what we did was add some data. So first added some maps to show people how these things developed in these low, medium, high density scenarios. That low density scenario in a lot of ways is quite important because you kind of show that, sure, you have these low density residential neighborhoods, but you do actually have development that will happen outside the growth management boundaries. So you can kind of keep those factors in mind. And also a data table, so people have access to quantitative data while they look at this. The other big thing, and this is part of the reason why I jumped into loggers before showing you this feature, this loggers east neighborhood, was that there were some considerations that were just kind of beyond the scope of what we're going to put into like the model, or things that just needed like further thinking to it. And we like only had so much time to refine everything. But these were important considerations. So what we did was create a window, added a window where community feedback was incorporated. Certain things that were important to note that people can pop up and have access to. In particular, in this Loggers East area, we had a bunch of conversations with community folks, particularly people that worked in environmental NGOs about the area, and saying that there is sensitive habitat out there. And in our scenario development, we're conscious of that and actually tried to develop outside that sensitive habitat. But they still made good points that even though you're developing outside, you got this park here that a lot of people are going to use. You're just going to have a lot more traffic in the area. So yeah, that's problematic. So we wanted to make sure that that information was captured, and that's one of the points that was in there. And then a few other comments about where the visualization kind of fell short. We thought that it was important to just throw that out there so that people had that information. And the last thing I wanted to just kind of mention about these visualizations is that you can only really develop so much area, right? Create a virtual environment for so much area. You know, there's practical considerations around how much time we have to develop them, but then there's also just considerations around how much walking people want to do in a virtual environment. So a lot of people don't, you know, the idea of making it exploratory and walk everywhere seems appealing at first, but it actually doesn't really work that well as a tool, and it feels very slow, and like I say, people want to teleport. What it does mean though is that we kind of miss some key elements of some of the scenarios in the actual visualization, or in the actual navigable, the walkable part itself. Like for instance, here towards the east, as you saw in those maps, we had much more space for agricultural land. You can't walk over there, but there's much more space for it over there. So instead, what you do is with these visualizations, you kind of do these clever tricks where in this case, as you can see, like it's hard to probably see in your screen, but we have these signs that show that there's some farmers markets down there. And we're just gonna wait it out a little bit because at some point you'll see a tractor come through here, right? And that was the other the element to just to give people the hint that that's what the area would look like. And once again, it might actually seem like we're just being, there's a tractor, right? Might just seem that we're being cute, but these are sort of things that this is the type of infrastructure activity that you do see around there, and it does actually kind of give people like a more a visual sense of what place might be like. So it kind of gives people more information in these more subtle ways. So I'm just going to quit this one right here, and you can download the visualization from the website, but it is fairly heavy. Like it's about the thing is over a gigabyte or so, or at least around a gigabyte. So I thought for your exploration, I would just put this down for you. Like this is a link to a video that will allow you to just kind of take a look. It's a video link that it gives a demonstration of walking through the visualization and the different features. And what I think we might do right now is just give 5 minutes where if you go into that chat box, you'll see that link above where there's the Model Explorer. Click that, you know, play with that Model Explorer a little bit. Click on that video link. You can just run and look at that video. And while you're doing that, maybe I'll just pop back into the visualization itself and just kind of walk through to give that as a bit more of the background right there. So you can look at the video for the visualization. You can also see me demonstrating it as well. So yeah, I think we'll just do that. And I did see the question here, which video game development tools were used to build this? So it was Unity 3D is the software we use. There is a free version of it, which we used. So let you know, you can do that with a free version. So it was a mixture of kind of Unity 3D was the final video game development place for it. But there was a workflow from ArcGIS, SketchUp to create objects, and Photoshop to create textures, and then Unity 3D was its final home. That's where we compiled everything. So yeah, please feel free to click those links and explore the tools. While you're doing it, I really would like you to kind of think about these different things, these different questions. What do you find interesting about the community development scenarios when using the Model Explorer and visualizations? What are the differences between the Model Explorer and visualizations? What are the respective strengths and weaknesses? How would you think the model and scenarios would differ if developed for your hometown? So that's the other thing. Like we talked about throughout, this is a collaborative participatory process that we developed specifically for Squamish's needs. So in your thinking, like, well, what would a model look like in my town? What sort of visual elements would we see in these scenarios for what would be appropriate to my home area? How could we apply these tools and processes to my home place? So those are the questions. I don't know if we don't necessarily have to have a formal discussion about it. I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts in the group chat. Yeah, and yeah, I would encourage you just to do that for a few minutes, and then after that, I will present a little bit and do a little bit of a follow-up on what the community said about these tools, how they assessed it. Yeah, so I think it's we got 4:55 right now. Oh, sorry, I'm on Pacific time, right? But yeah, just give it about 5 minutes. So on the hour mark, then I'll jump in and just see if there's anyone. And then post your thoughts as you do it. Please use the chat box. But in the meantime, for the 5 minutes, I'll just kind of walk through the visualization. So if you want to just watch me tour that and demo that, then you're more than welcome. Maybe I'll put up the sound too. So can you actually hear the sound, Sela?
We were before, yeah. I'm not sure about now, but I heard birds and dogs.
Ah, cool. Good, good.
Yeah, that was a nice touch. Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, like, you know, all of these elements, they're not just cute, even though they do feel cute to be like it feels immersive, but yeah, it makes sense to have all those elements. That's really great. I wanted to ask, how did you come up with making it more like a game or utilizing video game development tools?
Yeah, yeah, it's strange because it's actually there's not that much research that's doing this, which seems a little surprising once it. Yeah, once you kind of realize that you can actually use a lot of free and open source software for it. But basically, what happened was I started this visualization journey with my research in the coastal context. And prior to this, there's been a lot of work that's been done in visualizations, realistic landscape visualizations. Quite often what they'll do though is there'll be static images or have like limited movement in there. And in the terrestrial sense, maybe that's okay. Maybe that's not that big of a deal. But we found in the coastal sense, one of the key things about integrated coastal management is you have to think about them as interrelated, interconnected land and sea domains, which meant that we had to move in there. Also, coasts are very dynamic environments, which meant that we needed to get animated and dynamic elements in there. And we're thinking, well, how do we do this? Well, video game software seemed like the logical conclusion for that. So after we did in that coastal sense, it was the coast and that coastal planning that inspired it. But ultimately, we kind of realized that, I mean, this has applications everywhere for community planning and other areas too.
Right. We also have another question. Were you interested in measuring the impact of the visualization on decision makers? If so, how much of an impact did it have?
Yeah, definitely are interested in that. The thing is, we haven't actually really necessarily got a chance to measure the impact is done on real life decisions, and that's only just because of the limitation of the experimental length itself. So, you know, the experiment kind of ended just with us like engaging the focus group folks, the local government and community stakeholders, say like, hey, what do you think about these tools? And also talking to people. We also had an open house and talked to community members saying like, what do you think about these tools? In order to do like that impact on decision makers, it would be more of a longitudinal process where we'd follow up with it. And my future visualization research, this is actually something that we do want to do. So we'll have case study research that follows this over time. Now, part of the thing is though, there has to be a bit of commitment to like poke and prod people and think that like, hey, are you actually still using this? And in order for that to happen, the next step in this research means that that we have to train people how to develop them and actually use Unity 3D and implement scenarios and actually kind of develop it further. So that's what we're actually going to. That's kind of the next stage, and I'm hoping to do that with some of my future research. And I have plans for grant applications to do that. Now, in terms of just thinking about like potential impact, we did actually ask people like, where do these tools fall short? We're really interested in that, but we also asked them where it's useful, right? And for a lot of the community folks, and we'll actually talk about this in the next slide, there was definitely a lot of talk about the potential. The planners and NGOs said, talked about how this would give them a good platform to talk about some of their community concerns. They said that particularly like now meshing them with some of their community plans, it allowed them to bring like modeling data to talk about some of the things that they were thinking about before, what densification looks like, and be a bit more, even a bit more specific around it. You know, just thinking about like different ways that you can do it. So yeah, there was definitely some positive feedback about its potential. And I actually found in the open house event, there was like a lot of like really good discussion on that. And I won't get into too much detail about that because we'll talk about that in the next few slides.
Yeah. Awesome.
Maybe just a couple more minutes, and yeah, I'd be really interested. Anyone have any thoughts on those questions as coming in? Any sort of interesting insights that have come out for you?
Yeah, feel free to type any comments or questions into the chat box, or you can also email information@rciscience.ca. We're also monitoring that if you want to be a little bit more anonymous. Or you can even privately message one of us.
And if you don't, I mean, it's don't
okay as well.
Yeah, exactly. That's okay.
Oh, we got another question. Did you encounter any cultural limitations?
Cultural limitations. Okay. I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more about the cultural limitations. I wonder if are we thinking about local culture in terms of people engaging with the tools, whether they feel like they can or not, or are we talking about local culture in terms of whether like certain scenarios would actually mesh with local culture? And I can answer both questions actually if you're thinking broadly.
If you can, yeah, if you would like to unmute yourself, I think that should be fine. We are recording this and potentially putting this on YouTube. So if you don't mind unmuting yourself, go ahead for sure.
Hello, thank you for, this is my question, Tejas here. So I meant in terms of, given the different ethnic backgrounds, whether there was any, it's not typical for a lot of other countries to have local involvement in the planning process. So even to see a visualization tool is a significant step forward. In Canadian terms, it is probably a logical progression, but in some instances, it's a revolutionary step. So did you encounter any limitations in terms of citizens or residents not being able to participate fully in this process or not being able to understand it?
Yeah. Like in Squamish, didn't have necessarily any limitations around the participatory aspect of things. I mean, a lot of communities in BC, and as you probably noticed, like across Canada, there were a lot of processes around community engagement as it is. So it was somewhat of a bit of a natural thing. Particularly like we have things called integrated community sustainability plans. I don't know if you're familiar with these, but those are prevalent in a lot of places in BC and in various places across the country, but particularly you see a lot of them in BC. And all of those like incorporate and they involve some sort of participatory planning process. So in a lot of ways, this Squamish made a bit of a case study. This is like a bit of an easy fit. Also, we reached out to a couple different communities, and the fact that Squamish was interested in this kind of went to show that that this is a tool that they would use, right? And a tool that they're interested in developing. So I think you're making a very good point. If I were to go out to a city that's just not interested in participation and engagement, just by the nature of how we can establish that the participatory community-based research relationship, we might actually have issues just right at the get-go, right? So that I think that is a very good point. Now, in terms of like actual local culture, the Squamish is a fairly small town. We did try and invite people of like various places. It's hard to say like how culturally different people were, and they're diverse in terms of their interests and organizations, but and had different worldviews. But I don't know if I could possibly say that there was a huge like there wasn't necessarily a huge ethnic diversity in a lot of the people that were participating there, and that was just kind of a bit of a nature of perhaps maybe the town, but also the people that were interested in engaging. That latter part is pretty important because I do want to make it quite clear that we did invite a bunch of people, but we're not going to force people to come to the table. So there were huge gaps in how this thing was developed, and I fully recognize one of the big gaps was Squamish First Nations. So we reached out to a couple folks from Squamish First Nations, and there just wasn't necessarily that much interest in participating in the project, which is okay. But we also recognize that that's a limitation of these types of tools. So with that thinking and with that in mind, I know I've mentioned this a couple times, but I think it's okay to reiterate it now. I like to make these tools so that they are flexible things that can be developed and redeveloped. So that at least gives opportunity in the future that say like, if some of the people that I reached out to from Squamish First Nations start seeing these things and say like, okay, well, you know, maybe this would be of use, or maybe we would like to kind of adapt this, expand this for some of our community planning interests, at least you have capacity to do that. But yeah, like I think at that point, I think it's good to very, very much recognize that, yeah, the folks that we sort of reached out for Squamish Nation weren't necessarily interested in this project, and that's okay, but it does mean that there was definite gaps. It's a point that I'll make at the end as well too. You're definitely limited, as much as you try and be inclusive, you're limited to the people that are interested in engaging in the project, and inclusivity. You know, from my standpoint, it doesn't mean that we can really force people to the table, but it does also create those limitations.
Yeah, I imagine there could even be maybe some technological gaps in terms of people who may not be as comfortable using technology. Have you encountered any of those issues?
Yes, that is a question that I could definitely address, because we did, in this particular one, we had people of all very age ranges, right? So that was different from when I first did this. The first project that I did in that coastal visualization, I invited people that lived on the Squamish Peninsula, which is out in the Greater Victoria area. There was a visualization that was in a park that was near that area, and I was asking people just like basically citizens or residents of the area to show up, like whoever was interested in coming. Now, a lot of people out there are in older demographics, and people that can participate in these sort of things or interested in participating are often like in older demographics, right? So in this particular case, it was pretty useful for us because we're getting with a lot of the people that were 50, 55 and over, trying to play with video game equipment. And you know, I'm just shy of 40 myself, and I would say that I was like, luckily I was a teenager when some of these first-person games came
Right.
out, right? So like I just kind of made that cut in a lot of ways, but yeah, it was not intuitive. Now, interesting enough, we also had this like we had this like open lab day where grade sixers came to our school event, came to our labs, and we just showed them the research we're working on. And that coastal visualization, they're better at it than me. Like they could just go in, I didn't have to explain anything, right? So yes, absolutely, there is definitely a age gap there. There's some limitations around that. Like the newer generations will probably certainly grow into this, but of course then the next big tool we're gonna port this, and I've tried some tests in virtual reality. So like the next big tool will say like, okay, well now we have to learn another technology, right? But yeah.
Awesome. We got a Kirsten says, "Oh, we want to see the VR version." Yeah, I'm sure that would be really cool. We have another question. Sorry, just finding it. You note that this is a research project. Are there any city planners interested in adopting this planning and communication process?
Yeah, I mean, I've presented on this a couple times, and definitely a lot of interest in the research realm, and also I've talked to some folks. I did a recent virtual presentation and talked to some folks that were interested in doing using similar tools for climate adaptation and watershed planning. So things like that. There definitely is interest. Actually, and I was also very heartened that the city of Squamish got back to me and were kind of interested in saying, hey, there's sort of things, can we use these techniques for other projects that we're looking at? So absolutely interest is there. The gap between research and practice is always frustratingly large, particularly for a person like me that actually wants the research to be practical. So in this particular case, I did take, as you probably noticed, I did take efforts to make this as relevant to the community as possible. But still, it's hard to say what the next steps are. And this is why, as I was talking about before, I think really what needs to be done is design a research project where people that are in the community, folks that are actually local to there, are trained on how to use it, and then we follow up and whether they are using it. So I do think that's important. I'm very committed to this, and eventually we'll get that forward. There is something, and I'm sure there's probably a lot of people in the audience that feel this sense too. When I was doing my coastal PhD project, one of the questions I got was, is this worth it cost benefit wise? Like all the effort that went into this and creating these visualizations, is this actually worth it in terms of like, the expense, the resources that are used and so forth, right? Now, that's the impression that people have. Like people will kind of look at this and like, wow, this is just a lot going on. This is probably just way beyond the scope of what we can do. But like, I do want to stress that in my PhD stuff, the thing that took a lot of time was just trying to come up with a good workflow and good process. Then after that was done, I made a real strong argument and said like, hey, I think honestly, now that we know how to do this, I could probably train up 2 co-op students within a co-op semester. And without sounding a little too cheeky, co-op students are not the most expensive in terms of like hiring resources, right? So that's the expense part, but it's good co-op experience too. So I can hire 2 co-op students to develop these visualizations and do the bulk of the work. And lo and behold, it worked. The majority of what was done here was 2 co-op students that worked at Quest University, the university that I collaborated with in Squamish. So I actually think that part of this is just demystifying it and saying that no, this is accessible. You can do this, and it's not that expensive. And the other element I like to bring in, I made this point very strongly in my PhD defense, was that maps aren't cheap. There's so much data that goes in there. Those things that you kind of take for granted, those satellite images, like there's a lot of capital that went in building them. But now we just have access to them. So if we start building these things up, these tools, and just have them, then we can build and rebuild and redefine and put more things in there. It's just we have to start kind of creating those bases, those starting points.
Awesome. Yeah, that sounds really amazing. I'm really looking forward to when we can actually use these sort of everywhere. So I think we're about time to close up. Do you have any ending points?
Yes, yes. If you don't mind, I was just gonna
Yeah, perfect. Yeah,
now
go
that you've
ahead.
yeah, right on. Now that that you've had a chance to explore and ask your questions, and thank you for your questions. I appreciate that that interest. I wanted to let you know what Squamish thought about these tools. So as I mentioned, there was a focus group, a final focus group, but I also had an open house event. Like I say, I wanted this to be engagement tools inclusive of broader community members. So we just had an open house event that we tried to distribute and advertise, broadcast widely, allow everyone to, if they want to, anyone to show up and just play with the tools. And we did it at the Quest University Lab, and people could come in and ask questions and try both the model explorer and visualization. Between the focus group and the open house event, there was these 5 points that came out that I thought that would be interesting to share. A lot of this was really from the open house event too. Like they had some really neat insights. One of the things that that came out was the model explorer and visualizations are complementary tools. So using these things as complementary tools, they are not substitutes for one another. And I think I made that point fairly clearly before. They do different things, but this feedback really did highlight this element. That people said the model explorer actually referred to as more objective in terms of what they can think of. They had clear ideas of metrics of saying like, this thing or that thing, this is what these scenarios do. Whereas the visualizations were more subjective. People said that it gives you more of a feeling of what it might be like. So really connecting with those place-based values. The demonstrating the livability of different community futures, this was another thing that came out, really related to that visualization point. You know, a lot of people said that they found the visualizations useful because they could actually get a kind of a, you know, not a really defined sense, but sort of a visceral, nebulous sense of like, is this a place that I could actually live in, like, and see myself on a day-to-day basis? And, you know, I mean, people can, as planners or like decision makers, and even as researchers, sometimes the idea of, respecting sense of place and people's place attachment might seem like icing on the cake as you're developing a community, but it is important. It's the reason why people are attached, love, and invest in their community, right? Is one of the main reasons, I should say. So yeah, that livability was kind of a neat point. The other thing was that using these tools to incorporate community values into local planning. This was heartening to hear. I was pleased, and this kind of went to the point around, is there any value for decision making? People did say that this was comprehensive enough that they could say that there are certain values that they have around local economy, environment, and say that does it actually align with these values? People even actually stress that it doesn't mean that everyone has the same values, but it allows for a platform for having discussions around these things. And even as you're having discussions, you can bring up your values and people can have those conversations saying, I like this because of this, I like this because of this. Okay, now we know these two different groups have like very, might have different concerns or interests, or they might have aligned concerns. There might be common ground there. The other part was illuminating trade-offs around different ways Squamish could develop. Just as important as the community values parts, how it aligns with it, is good to know where things fall short. Were a couple people that say that they liked the low density residential style. They really do like that. But you know, with using both model explorer and visualizations, they really found it was concerning the amount of low density residential that you'd have to develop to accommodate the same population, right? So what happened to us actually, it seemed that the even though I didn't have enough quantitative data to do actual reliable statistical analysis on it, just kind of more from a general numbers around it and general conversation, it seemed that there was less variability on people's preferences for that medium density scenario. And it's just the beginnings, like I say, like don't have statistically reliable information on this, but it's sort of like a beginnings of this. It indicates to me that people are looking at this as a possible compromise and in some ways, right? And I did actually get that qualitative feedback. People talked about how this is acceptable and you can still get those density values, or like the things that you can, the good stuff that comes from density. And then the last part was understanding the limitations and opportunities associated with space and land use. Yeah, and going back to that livability thing, some people found that the high density scenarios were perfectly acceptable and like, you know, say like, oh, this is great. You can actually fit this many people in limited space. Some people said like, ooh, don't like this, it's crowded. But then there's that medium sort of like, Goldilocks area where people said like, okay, this is kind of neat. And then this other point, this follow-up point saying that people were actually quite fascinated about how many people you can actually fit in like such limited space. Like it was very, very eye-opening for them. So that was the kind of another point that came out of that. Final thing, and I'm going to close on this, some reflections and conclusions on the process itself. Yeah, I think this was kind of a nice wrap up. The approach taking participatory processes, including people in the development of the tools. Was this useful? Yes. It led to a model that was relevant to the community, but its comprehensiveness was depended on the diversity of the community members engaged. So this is going back to that point where saying that, hey, I tried to reach out to a number of different people, but really the model is only going to capture the values and interests of people that could show up to the table, people that are interested in showing up to the table that first time around. We found that in the second workshop where we had to refine it based on people's feedback, but also kind of understand that there are people that might be not interested or a little hesitant of showing up to some of these things. So this leads to the second point, that these tools should be developed through iterative processes, meaning they should be flexible, allowing people to develop it through multiple stages of feedback. So hopefully that a tool like this can be developed even further in the future as more people are interested in that. And the last part was that just from a research standpoint, the participatory process was good. It built relationships between researchers and communities, which is valuable for accessing data and relevant work. It was great, it was good just to be able to collaborate and work with these folks and develop those relationships, but also had some real practical value. The people that I worked with, in some ways, it gave them a little bit of a sense of, I found a sense of ownership around these tools and how they developed, which meant that they pointed me to data sources and other work that I can incorporate and made it easier to create this model. And for something this complex, that's very valuable stuff. So yeah, it worked out quite well, and I could recommend that. And that's it. I'm just going to leave you on this slide, and this is the website. You can actually download the visualization, access the Model Explorer from there. There's reports and academic publications if you want some light reading. But yeah, if you want to just kind of play with the tools themselves, you can access it from there and learn more about the project. I encourage you to go there. If you have any follow-up questions for me, I'm happy to take those, and feel free to take my email.